And welcome back to the 5th edition of the Superhero Project podcast. I am running solo this week, but that's fine because we've got two of my absolute favorite people in the world. We have Drake McWhorter, also known as Comic Drake online, and Owen Farrington, also known as Owen Likes Comics. I'm not too sure, but I'm pretty sure they both like comics.
Just a little.
I take objection to that. I don't know where you'd get such a I don't know where you'd get such an idea from.
It's just outlandish, all these rumors going around the internet.
It's fake news. We live in the age of misinformation.
It's just fake news.
Starting off strong.
Oh god. So both of you have made a huge career for yourselves online, talking about superhero history and obscure parts of superhero, pantheons. What are your origin stories, to put it as blunt as possible? How do you guys get started in all this?
All right, Owen,
so I'll take this first. So recently, maybe a couple of months ago, I was interviewed by someone that was they wanted to interview me as part of their undergraduate dissertation, which was a comic studies adjacent thing. So I sat down with them and we did a short 5 or 6 questions interview. And they framed the first question the exact same way. They asked what my origin story was.
I'm so unoriginal.
No, I just, without thinking about what I was going to say, I just blurted out I was bit by a radioactive academic. And I think I'm going to stick with that.
But what was the academic's major?
Comic studies.
Well, naturally. It's a time travel scenario. That guy ended up becoming the academic, went back in time, bit you in order to create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it's
that
like a
would
Days
make
of Future
sense.
Past type deal.
That's the truly getting hands-on with the academic comic studies.
Yes. But no, to give a more kind of accurate answer to your question. So I am Owen. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Mikayla. I am a historian of media and popular culture, currently working at Edgehill University in the UK. And I am also the creator, host, and overall person behind the YouTube show Owen Likes Comics, which dissects and discusses the real world history behind comic book stories and characters, and looks at the kind of contextual background behind big events, the creation of big characters, major status quo changes, etc., etc. In regards to kind of when I got into comics, you're probably looking at the late 1990s, early 2000s. I always seem to credit Ultimate Spider-Man as like my gateway book into Marvel and DC. And then when I really got into like covering comics analytically was about 10 years ago, I want to say, kind of early to mid 2010s. I started the YouTube channel not long after. I originally did some kind of writing and little freelance projects here and there. And then whilst completing my undergraduate degree in history, I set up this YouTube channel, which over the past however many years it's been, those two, at once seemingly very disparate career paths have just slowly merged together. Combining my academic pursuits in history with my analytical love of comics and the history behind comics, and they have now ended up becoming the thing that occupies my brain at any given moment.
It's wonderful when that happens. The only problem is that you find that you never have any free time because everything somehow relates back to work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing being able to kind of turn a hobby and a passion of yours into like a career. But it also means you then don't have a hobby because all you do is work. So it's quite the thing to balance, and I'm sure Drake, you can relate to that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the content creation field for a long time. Literally, my first day out of high school was when I started working for a professional YouTube company. So back then, I was strictly about video games. So all video games ended up being work in some capacity. The only hobby that I haven't monetized yet has been board games, and even then, I design board games in my free time, and I'm in the first round of pitching for some of those. So pretty soon I'm going to have no hobbies left.
I love how you added yet.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely going to be happening. I don't know how to just do unproductive leisure.
It's really difficult. I don't know how other people manage. So you've been in the content creation game for pretty much your entire adult life, because I know all three of us are around the same age. So that's got to be kind of scary.
Yeah, no, it definitely has been. I've been making content for fun since I was a sophomore in high school. Then I think I amassed my first like 2,000 subscribers during that time, and then I used that that background in order to pivot to work for this company called screwattack.com, which was a game journalism site. And then from there, I went and worked for this large company, Game Theory. And during that time, to bring it to my comic origin story, is when I actually discovered comic books. Because of how large the channel is and how deep I go into analyzing stuff, people assume that I've been a longtime fan, but that's not the case. I've only been reading comics for about 10 years at this point. And in the most ironic twist of fate ever, it's all because of a girl. Normally you hear it the other way around, but I was seeing this girl in college. She loved comics. I had only really read various stories on Wikipedia, just little summaries. So I thought, oh yeah, I got this. She handed me one book, wasn't a big fan. Then she handed me Batman Court of Owls, and I became obsessed. And that hyperfixation then became that took over all of my life. So I thought, maybe I should monetize this so I could at least feel better about this nonstop addiction. And yeah, then just Comic Drake spun out of there. And I've been doing this for about 10 years strong.
That is fantastic. I mean, yeah, there's always been like the stereotype of, oh, as soon as a guy meets a girl, he drops comics. So it's lovely to hear that there was a flip side to that. Out of curiosity, do you remember what that first book was that you didn't like?
So having been a big fan of superhero media, I played a lot of the video games, I watched a lot of the shows, etc. Whenever, like, people had tried to get me into comics before, but the first time I tried reading a comic was in the mid-90s. I was at a comic store buying some Pokemon cards, and I had this Ultimate Guide to the X-Men that I loved reading through, and I loved this character Cable. So I was like, I want to try to read a Cable book. So I picked up an issue, and it's a cover where he's being, like, his clone Strife is standing over him, grabbing him by the scruff of his shirt. And I picked it up, and I had no idea what was going on inside. And that's when I thought, okay, comic books, the continuity is too outsider unfriendly. I'm never going to be able to understand or enjoy these. So I just never bothered reading a book again. And when other people tried, I didn't bother because I just assumed the continuity is too outsider unfriendly. So when I was talking to my girlfriend at the time, she said, okay, who's your favorite superhero? And I said, Green Lantern. She said, okay, well, here with the New 52, they rebooted the universe. So here, try this Green Lantern book. And I said, okay, but if there is one, if I get to one part in here that references older stuff that I haven't read, I'm done. Lo and behold, the New 52, the only two books that didn't fully reset their continuity were Batman and Green Lantern. So I got to a point where Carol Ferris was talking about how she used to be a Star Sapphire. I said, nope, I'm done. So she groaned, hand me Court of Owls, and said, you're going to be able, enough to read this. And then I understood that I didn't need to know everything to enjoy a story.
That's such a brilliant way in.
It's really interesting hearing you kind of explain how, like, continuity almost scared you off, because I think for me, I think I almost came into comics with the complete opposite attitude where, so like I said earlier, Ultimate Spider-Man was kind of my gateway book, and that is a book you can read without having read any Spider-Man comic ever. It's in its own universe. It's the first book in the series. So as long as you read the issues of that come out, you're not going to miss out on anything. So jumping from that into like main Marvel universe stuff and then into DC as well, I kind of jumped into reading mainline DC around the same time as Avengers Disassembled, New Avengers, Civil War, that kind of period. So that's an era of like massive turbulence of change in the Marvel universe. And so jumping in the thick of that, like the first like big event I remember reading is House of M, a story where the entire universe and reality is changed in wild and extraordinary ways. And so for me, kind of like jumping in with Disassembled, the Avengers as they had been for the last kind of couple of years had been destroyed and gone, and in its place with this new kind of more street level team, full of characters I'd never heard of. I knew Captain America, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Wolverine, but I was like, who is Luke Cage? Who is the Sentry? Who is Jessica Jones? Who are all these villains that they're fighting? So instead of like detracting me, it kind of gave me the urge to go back and learn about these things and read old comics and find out, kind of fill the gaps in. And it's funny because like being someone that covers comics online and someone that has a kind of social media presence as I don't want to say like a comics influencer, but as a kind of pundit and a commentator of the goings on of the medium in the industry, people always seem to be surprised at how very little new comics I actually read. Mm-hmm. How I don't have a pull list. I'm not reading anything issue to issue. I'm very rarely actively keeping up with a lot of the current stuff. I'm always at least like 2 years behind everyone else. But that's because I just spend so much of my time reading back comics from years before I was born, reading things
same.
from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. You know, a lot of the videos I've made this year and a lot of the books I've been writing about extensively are filling in blind spots in the kind of mid to late 1990s, the periods in which when I got into comics, people were telling me, don't go and read all that stuff because it's awful. And a lot of it still is not great. But like recently going back and reading all of the Triangle era Superman books, the Superman Blue era, things that like if I kind of just jumped into comics in the 2000s and just kind of ran forward, outside of like knowing all of like the big stuff you have to know from the older generations, I probably never would have read any of that stuff. And I'm not saying my life is, I've been enriched by reading late 90s Superman comics, but there is something I think to be had about diving into a lot of the old stuff as well.
Yeah, there's definitely stuff of value, even just having the context for, it's a blanket statement that I make constantly of just the 90s almost entirely sucked for comics, which
yes,
a lot of people agree with. However, that's not entirely the case. But even the bad stuff, it's good to at least know the context, because for years I was just parroting what I heard other comic fans say. But it's only when I started doing like what you were doing, Owen, and going back and reading some of those blind spots that I start to actually, oh, this is why, this is who Rob Liefeld is. I understand now.
Yeah, I think for me, coming at it from a historian's perspective and coming at it from someone who does a lot of archival research, and especially someone that a lot of my ongoing academic research is interested in the history of print media. So newspapers, magazines, periodicals, looking at kind of what we can learn about specific goings on and moments in time through those kind of sources. One of the things I always find so interesting is using the kind of Superman Blue for an example, going back and reading things like the letters pages of those books. How were fans at the time of that story reacting to it in real time? What were the creators of these stories? What were the DC writers and editors and artists? What were they saying about it in interviews and things at this time? So it's not only kind of going back and reading the stories themselves, it's also getting all of that interesting contextual stuff that fascinates me, at least.
Yeah, well, so one thing about letters pages that I have been kind of 50-50 on, because having not been around for most of these books that I'm covering these days, I do rely on secondhand accounts of how characters, events, etc. were perceived. Though it is interesting because in the letters pages, there's a level of editorial there where they're almost always going to publish exclusively the positive reviews, and maybe the occasional negative one to show some semblance of there being a balance. But I think that also can distort things in a way itself. And that's why I think it's interesting that for Owen specifically, with you going back and doing the deeper archival research to really get a true overview.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that, so I think social media has a lot of detractors in kind of modern society. It's rotting our brains from the insides. But one of the things I think is really going to be really useful for historians of all kind of disciplines, but thinking about it from a kind of comic scholar perspective here is, like we said, if you wanted to go back and look at, so earlier this year, I delivered a conference paper looking at the death of Gwen Stacy from 1973 and the reaction to that by Marvel fans when Amazing Spider-Man issue 121 came out. And like outside, like I said, outside of the published letters pages that were in the issue and the kind of following issues, it can, and outside of what other historians have wrote, it can be difficult to get a sense of what the kind of everyday comic fan thought of that. Whereas today, if in 50 years' time, I was going to go do a historical study on the reaction to, say, the current Zeb Wells Spider-Man run that seems to be quite controversial in a similar way, if Twitter is archived and social media is archived, it will be so easy for a historian to go back and look at what was the discourse surrounding this topic at the time. What does that tell us? In the same way that, like, looking at comics from the late 90s and the 2000s, you have things like message boards, which can be really useful to get a sense of what audiences and how they were reacting and how they were feeling about a particular story or a going on or a rumor. But I do think, this is something I think kind of generally about historical research, that social media will offer an interesting lens into how fans and consumers of media are reacting to them in a way that the further back we go, we don't really have that perspective.
No, absolutely. I mean, I agree about going back and looking at the letters pages. I read something recently by the theorist Daniel Stein, who was talking about the idea of ownership from fans, and letters and comments pages. They played very heavily into that. But then there's also that idea of, well, those letters pages were also specifically chosen by the editorial team. They were going through it and going, well, actually, we don't want to print this letter because maybe it's too derogatory, or this one is getting really close to something we don't want to reveal yet. So they're almost playing authorship with the fans' authorship. And now that you've got something like Twitter, where everyone has a voice and everyone can speak, mostly, you have everyone shouting into a void, and it's almost difficult to pick apart someone who's being critical for the sake of, well, this critically doesn't line up because Spider-Man would never do this, and someone just going, yes, this fucking sucks. It all now has that weight.
So I was just going to say, I think that's a really interesting thing that historians are going to have to deal with, going from maybe certain periods of history, looking at kind of media history, where there isn't a massive amount of sources pertaining to how an audience reacted to a certain storyline or a moment in time going on in a piece of media, to now where there is kind of too much sources and too much information. So it's going to be a really interesting dichotomy of how does, if I was going to do a study on the reaction to any, I don't know, pick any kind of current ongoing comic book storyline, how, so I've just lost my trail of thought slightly, what I was going to say, but now it's kind of, how do I, there's so much information, how do I kind of filter through that and find, like you said, what is actually credible, valid criticism? What is criticism coming from a place of love and kind of trying to be constructive? And what is trolling? What are haters? What is people with agendas? It can be quite difficult to pick those apart, I guess, especially when you're removed from the context in which those posts are made. And
what makes it more difficult, in my opinion, is that it's difficult to tell which of the, you know, when certain tweets, for example, will blow up, who's to say that that's not just going viral in a local echo chamber? You know, the Spider-Man fandom is wrought with a bunch of more problematic figures, especially on Twitter. And so they will all just, like, you know, retweet and signal boost each other's stuff. But that might not necessarily be what the general consensus is. That's just a very loud vocal minority. And I think it's going to be equally difficult to parse for historians looking back.
Absolutely. And I think because sometimes you do get that echo chamber, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but that echo chamber will suddenly change its views like 2 months later.
Oh, yeah.
And now it's a lot harder to find, well, what did people actually think about this? Because who's saying what they actually thought and who's echoing?
Mm-hmm. I find that to be extraordinarily frustrating. But I think it's just part of how social media works. It encourages groupthink in a way and on a level that we've never seen before.
Yeah. So just thinking back about, not to kind of change the conversation too much, but Drake, there's a really interesting question that I want to present to you.
Sure.
And I think that I'm interested in getting your insight in comparison to kind of how I'm thinking about the question.
Let's grill Drake.
So I feel like we do fairly similar kind of things in terms of the content we make. I don't think that's a reach to say that there is some overlap in the kind of stuff that we're interested in researching and presenting and talking about. But I feel like we come from quite different backgrounds. You kind of came into it as an adult who hadn't read a lot of comics and has kind of been reading almost kind of like and catching up as you kind of build your kind of online career, which I think is a really interesting approach. I'm kind of coming at it as someone that was a kind of a diehard fan for much of my kind of youth and teenage years, then dipped away, then has kind of been come back and had my interest kind of re-sparked by what I do now. But also the fact that, like, obviously I come from a very kind of academic and scholarly background. I'm someone that's been in university for the entire time that my channel has existed, both as a student and now as a member of staff and as an active researcher.
And I very much have not.
Well, that's what I'm interested in saying, because like it's interesting for me to create historical content and to make whether you want to call them videos or like little short form history documentaries about comics. You know, I'm very much coming at it from the perspective of a practicing academic making a YouTube video. And something I've always been fascinated with you about is your ability to be a historian without necessarily the kind of formal academic background. And I still would classify you as a historian in every sense of the word in what you do.
I would second that.
So what I'm really interested in hearing about is kind of comparing it to my own experiences, how you ended up in the rabbit hole of uncovering comic book history, how you go about researching and producing the videos that you make.
Well, so first of all, Owen, a big reason why my content has shifted style is actually you have been a huge inspiration. And I'm not trying to copy your content. We especially go at things in very different ways, especially in how we present things. But at first, like a few years back, our mutual friend Dylan had mentioned your work before. You were another channel. ComicTube hadn't expanded out as large as it has today, and so you were a name that I was familiar with. And then when I finally got around to actually watching your content, falling in love with them, like, wow, okay, I see some really interesting things here that I would like to try and emulate more. I definitely view your work as, I think you were selling yourself short. You are doing those short form documentaries. I feel like every video that you produce is essentially an anthropology project in and of itself, because you're uncovering the landscape at the time. You're giving all of this additional context. You're going into the mindset of the writers, the state of the industry, etc. I find that to be all deeply interesting stuff. Whenever I first started making comic content, it was very short form. I'm talking like less than 5 minutes, generally like an advanced Wikipedia read. And it was watching content like yours that wanted me to expand things further out. But also what's interesting is that my content, since I've been making it since I was legitimately right out of high school, the channel has done a lot of maturing with me. I think all of us can agree that we were younger and dumber in our days of youth, and I still am. Every day I'm trying to become a better version of myself. But boy, howdy, do I look back on a lot of my old content and cringe. That's actually a reason why I'm redoing some of my older content by getting more in depth and looking at things more with the angle that I do now. So channels like you, Owen, but also Matt Draper, Casually Comics, Comic Tropes have all encouraged me to do deeper reads into looking up interviews, for instance, and seeing what the creative process was for these characters, events, etc. But also something that I've learned as I've been reading more and more comics, especially now that I wouldn't claim to be a Grant Morrison fan. I enjoy their work, but at the very least, I understand their work now in a way that I didn't at the very beginning. One of the first books I tried to read was Final Crisis, and that was a bad intro comic. I had no idea what was going on. But something that Grant Morrison does that I find very interesting is that the history of comics are frequently reflected in the world of comics themselves, especially with Grant Morrison doing such meta narrative, meta contextual narratives. So the more and more that I read comics, the more that I find, and by comics I strictly mean Marvel and DC. Of course, there's so many indie books that I love as well, but also the history of the industry in general. I mean, I just did a video on The Spot that came out yesterday, and in the background there is a construction company called Ditko. I'm like, oh, that's Steve Ditko. So even just knowing that one little bit, I think enriches the experience more, because so many of the writers and artists are fans of the medium and the history of the medium, just like we are, and they try to incorporate all of that as you go. So the more that I become a comic fan, the more that I've read, the more that I've learned about the history, the more that I found each book that I'm reading to be more deeply enjoyable. So I try to reflect that in my content as well. So anytime that I make a video and there's something new that I learned, there's a really good chance that my audience doesn't know that. So I try to add that in there as well. But I try to strike a general blend of not necessarily academic or historian, but I try to balance more of those elements that I was inspired by with y'all's channels, and then also trying to strike a bit more of my personality as well, which some people find grating, but that's taste might vary. I don't know how long I'll be able to do this career. As much as I love comics and I would love to do this for the rest of my life, I'm not ignorant to assume that this is long term. So by also building it partly around me as a personality, I'm hoping that I can take that audience and pivot to whatever my next venture might be. So that's more of the reason between the balance.
Oh, that's genuinely really fascinating. Thank you. And thank you for all the kind words you said about my work as well. It very much, it's a good thing we're not on camera, because I very much am blushing right now.
No, it's been really fun to not only get to know you as a colleague, but then also watching that evolve into a genuine friendship. Our relationship has been very interesting to watch blossom. And that I was trying to tell our friend Alex Lennon about this the other day, is that yes, I am a friend, but I'm also a huge fan of y'all's work. So it's an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, that's genuinely really sweet. So there's two interesting things I wanted to pick up on what you said there. And I'm sorry, Mikayla, if I've now accidentally became the host of this podcast. I haven't.
Oh no, go for it, because I've got some points as well, but you go first.
The first thing I thought was really interesting was you touching on Morrison as kind of ComicTube's preeminent Grant Morrison fanboy. The thought of someone's first book being Final Crisis fills me with so much existential dread.
It was in the first 10 books.
That is still way too. It's like whenever people are like, oh, I want to get my friend into Superman, what should I give them? And people always suggest All-Star. It's like, look, Mikayla might disagree. I think All-Star is by far the greatest Superman story ever written. But I would not give that to someone who only has like a casual understanding of the character. Morrison's work is incredibly, oh, Jesus. But Morrison's work is incredibly metatextual. They play around with meta narratives and intertextuality so much. And it's what makes me a historian of kind of the behind the scenes history of comics, such a fan of their work. And it's a reason why, because, you know, not only did you pick up on Morrison, but it's why I'm kind of my other favorite current writer is someone like Tom King, who a lot of their books is so deeply based around meta narrative. Books like Rorschach and Mr. Miracle. I made a whole documentary about his and Mitch Gerard's Mr. Miracle book and how it's, in addition to being a fascinating story about the new gods and the fourth world, it's also a commentary and analysis on Jack Kirby and the life and career of him. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing to pick up. The second thing I thought was really interesting was just you're talking about the process and the approach you take when making videos. And a video I wanted to ask you about in particular, because it's probably my favorite of yours, or at least the most favorite that comes to mind.
I hope it's the one I'm thinking of.
Well, now I feel on edge that it's not.
I'm curious as to what content you enjoy, because again, we do make such different content. So I'm interested in hearing what strikes a chord with you.
Okay, so the video, there's tons of your videos that I love and enjoy watching. But the one in particular that I really wanted to ask you about in this context, because I think it's, at least thinking about the examples that come to mind, it is the most kind of analytical and historically sourced and researched, was the video you put together about the Miracle Man lawsuits.
That's the one. Okay, great.
Yes.
I think that's one of your best works. I think that you covered that topic better than probably anyone else I've ever read in print media, on online media. The way you managed to cover what is an incredibly convoluted story of copyright and editorial and legal nightmares going on for decades and decades, the way you managed to break that down and make it make sense to someone who hasn't read, you know, decades old niche British comics from the 70s and 80s was really great. And it was so well researched and so thorough and so backed by citations and quotes and interviews and extracts. It was a proper piece of historical research in any definition of the term.
Thank you. I do consider that to be my magnum opus. I think that it, like, I will stroke my ego there. I think that is the greatest thing that I've made. And it's been years since I've felt about something like that. But that project, that took months to produce. And I'm really glad that everybody agrees that the hard work has paid off.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's an incredible video. And it goes back to kind of something I argue a lot, which is like the fact that history and historical research can be kind of presented in spaces outside of traditional academic circles, that it doesn't have to be, if you wanted to research that, it doesn't have to be on a journal article that gets put away behind a paywall somewhere only to be read by 300 people, that we can take historical information to the public and we can take it to where they consume media on places like YouTube and TikTok and Twitter and Instagram. And you are someone that does a very good job of that. So just using that video as an example, how did you go about researching and putting that piece of content together? So when you decided on the topic that you were gonna cover all of this, did you kind of set a plan out? How did you find all the sources? How did you analyze the sources? And how did you kind of construct the narrative and the argument that you presented throughout the video?
So the first thing is that this has been a topic, the Miracle Man fiasco was something that I've been interested in for the longest time. Since before I read comics, one of my favorite creators at the time, Movie Bob, introduced me to the concept of Miracle Man and everything that went into that. So that's always been something that was in the back of my head. Then Marvel
I should just say, I should just leave a disclaimer that I feel like I've let all of my British fans down by not saying Marvel Man.
That's fair. Yes.
If you want to just get me saying a couple of clean takes of Marvel Man, you can go back in post and just cut out the Miracle Mans and add the Marvel Mans back in.
What I'm super tempted to do is like call Paydrag and just say, "Oi, get in here. We're doing Marvel Man."
Yes, I wanted to give Pedrig a big shout out as well, because so much of that video, while I am proud of the legwork that I did in that, again, I am standing on the backs of giants for that one. Pedrig with Poison Chalice did such an amazing catalog of documenting everything that a lot of that video was based off of his interviews and research. So I definitely cannot take credit for all of the deep dive into that. And I tried to make that clear in the video as well, that I pulled a lot of sources from other people that had done a lot of the heavy lifting. So
like a true academic.
Yes.
Yeah,
and
that's
I
part
try
and
to
parcel of being a historian. You're constantly kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, working on the kind of on top of what has been covered before and building on that.
I think that's why it impressed us so much, because you were coming at it from a non-academic standpoint, but you were doing everything we do without being thousands of pounds in debt.
Oh, listen, nobody says I'm not thousands of pounds in debt. Well, so Owen, like you'd mentioned, we do cover similar topics. And so in general, I try not to take from the people that I watch, but whenever I'm watching videos from you and other colleagues, I do keep a separate tab open for whatever relevant documents that I have. So I have about like 600 Google Docs in session, basically one for like every character I can think of for every event, whatever. And so as I'm watching like you, Casually Comics, Comic Tropes, Matt Draper, everybody, etc., whenever you guys mention a quote or a source, I copy and paste that into my document, and then I put a question mark on it, because question mark in my internal notations means that I haven't independently verified it. So for every video that I do, I generally have like 1 to 2 pages of notes already written down from just as I'm reading other books, as I'm researching for other videos. So I have a tremendous head start. So throughout the time that I've been watching content, I'd known that one day I wanted to do a Miracle Man video. So I actually already had a few leads ready to go. So I tracked those down. And then another big thing for me is tracking down where other people got their quotations. So I just try to go as deep down as possible. I read everything. I got Poison Chalice. I also bought Todd McFarlane versus the World, which was just a book covering all of Todd McFarlane's various controversies, which I found interesting, even though it misquoted Neil Gaiman. And I posted about it on Twitter, and Neil Gaiman replied like, yeah, that's not true. Like, oh
yeah, I think Daniel has commented on that it was a misquote that he didn't catch by the time it went to the printers, because he's also a friend of the podcast. Hi, Daniel.
Oh, gotcha. Wow, I didn't know. I wish I could have reached out to him specifically. But yeah, no, Gaiman specifically reached out and said, yeah, I didn't say that. I'm like, okay, well, that would have been a great dunk in the video. But oh, and as you mentioned, to make it a little less like like an academic dissertation, is I found that story about Miracle Man I thought that it was just as, if not more interesting than the content of the book itself. And that kind of entertainment, like you could make a full movie about that. And so that's why I tried to present it as such as well. And also with there being so many quotes, I wanted this to be the Infinity War of ComicTube, and I wanted to bring as many people as possible on board from it. I even got some of my friends from Comic Talk to get on there. I tried to make it a who's who. I wish I had more quotes, because there were so many more people that I want to work with. But I think switching up the presentation style, breaking it up into separate parts, trying to add more jokes in there, I think that adds a bit of levity to everything. That's why I always try to do long chunks of history and narrative, and I pepper in jokes to try and keep people's interest. But another thing, which I actually think is the secret sauce to my channel success, is that I constantly read my scripts to people that don't read comics. And I read it to them over the phone with no visuals. So my goal is that if I can make the average person understand what's going on, even if they don't have a picture of what everything is going on, because comics are a visual medium, so that's half the storytelling is right there. But if I can explain it with just my words in a way that they can follow what's going on, then I see that as a success. And that's why every time I do like a large, when I'm reading, I'll read like 3 paragraphs or so, and I'll go, "Are you still with me? Anything makes sense?" And if they are confused about some parts, I'll paraphrase it, usually humorously, and that I'll then take that paraphrase and throw it into the script.
That's absolutely fascinating. It's really interesting to hear about your creative process in that sense. And my mom is tired of hearing my scripts. That is something I can certainly relate to as well.
I used to read mine to my cat, and I'm pretty sure she died of boredom.
Oh, gee, man. Okay, I was feeling bad because, like, oh no, Jones, and man. Okay, I don't feel bad anymore. That was a good joke.
So it's interesting for me because you touched on something that really kind of hit home for me, which is talking about the Miracle Man example and talking about how you thought the behind the scenes story of the copyright issue surrounding that character was just as, if not more, fascinating than the actual stories that Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman and other writers were telling, which is kind of the entire mission statement behind the work that I do, which is this idea that even in the worst comic book stories, so I recently covered the entire Superman Blue saga from the late 90s.
Yes, you did. Ugh.
I don't think it's a controversial, and look, art is inherently subjective.
Correct.
There is possibly someone listening to this podcast who that is their favorite run of any comic book character ever. Josh from Panels to Pixels probably loves Superman Blue.
I think he does.
That sounds right. I'm working on a 90s project. I'm getting him involved in that because I can't talk about the 90s and not include him.
Yeah, he really should grow a mullet and get some pouches.
Oh, please, can we just record him in the mullet and pouches, just with no context?
Yeah, so kind of sniping at other British comic tubers aside. So covering that is not a book I would ever read for leisure. And if it wasn't for the work I do, I probably never would have read that period of Superman, because it's, having read it, I can tell you that it's not something that really appeals to my tastes and sensibilities. I personally wouldn't call that an interesting period of Superman's history. In terms of the comics themselves, surprisingly, for a year of such monumental status quo changes, nothing really happens, and nothing's really happening in 5 issues a month. It's quite dull. But what's really interesting to me is, why did DC decide to do this? Why would they take probably the most recognizable fictional character in the entire world and change every single identifiable trait about their design? Why would you do that? What was the thought process? What was the lead up and the inspiration? And what was the kind of breaking point that caused this to happen when it did? What was the reaction to it, both internally and externally? And how was it remembered? They're the kind of questions that intrigue me, and they're the kind of questions that I like to answer in my videos. And so for you to touch on a very similar point in regards to how you produce content, I think is really fascinating, and shows that even if we're coming at it from slightly different backgrounds in terms of the kind of the way we research and the training that we've had to research, I think it shows that we both accomplish a very similar goal and do it well, of kind of presenting interesting, thought-provoking historical information about silly superheroes onto a medium that we can attract people outside of like traditional academic circles, which I think is important.
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, quick question for both of y'all. Owen, what you said raised an interesting question for me. What is a book that you guys have had to read for research that you weren't initially excited about, or that you wouldn't have normally read, but you ended up coming away as a genuine fan of?
Ooh. I will have to go and look real time just through the channel, because there's definitely plenty of examples of books that I wouldn't usually have covered, have done because there's an interesting history behind them, and ended up really enjoying them. Superman Blue, not necessarily being one of them.
Yeah, I figured that wasn't one of them. I know I have probably better examples off the top of my head, but the video that I just released for The Spot, for instance, I thought he was an interesting enough villain that I thought had a cool power, but I was never really interested in learning too much more, especially because in the small appearances that I saw him in, he hadn't really done much of real interest. But going back and reading his reintroduction in 2008 with Return to the Spot, where he's recontextualized as the silent assassin, I really enjoyed it. And then also, the first time I read the Spot's origin was because I was reading about a bunch of 80s Spider-Man stuff, because I was wanting details about his Spidey's relationship with Felicia Hardy, because at the end of the storyline where they fight the Spot, they end up breaking up, and that's their big breakup. Well, when I went and reread it for this video, I actually found myself paying attention, because I was more interested in the Spot that time, and I realized, oh, I actually like this book a lot more than I thought. And when I gave it a second glance with this new perspective, I ended up becoming one of the most interesting first villain fights that I had ever read. I really paid attention to how dynamic the art was and the creativity that was used in the powers. And I think that's probably some of my favorite issues.
See, that's great. I think some examples for me would be, so about 6 months ago, I did a deep dive into the West Coast Avengers series from the 1980s and early 1990s.
Classic.
covered the entire, I broke it into 3 eras based on the kind of 3 lead writers at the time, and looked at this interesting period of Marvel history, how it compared to things going on over at DC, for example, West Coast Avengers versus Justice League International, quite similar thematic books, but how they handled those approaches similarly and differently. And I really ended up coming away from that video with a newfound appreciation of not only the West Coast Avengers as a title, where previously I just saw it as the kind of like B-list Avengers book from the period when no one was really reading Avengers books anyway. But I not only came away with an appreciation of the team, but also a lot of the individual characters that were on it, that aren't characters that often get their own books.
Yeah.
Another example would be, a while back I covered the Batman Earth 1 books that Jeff Johns and Gary Frank did. An interesting trilogy of books that kind of reimagine Batman in a modern context, a la Marvel's Ultimate Universe. And after doing that video, I was interested to go and read more of the Earth 1 books. They tend to vary in quality. Some are quite interesting, some are less interesting. But one of the ones that I ended up making a separate video about and really struck a chord with me was the Green Lantern series.
Yeah.
Which is probably because I mentioned this, so I recently covered Emerald Twilight and the kind of introduction of Kyle Rayner and the kind of Hal Jordan's turn into becoming a villain in the 1990s. And I'm not a massive Green Lantern reader. It's not really a character I've ever followed in great detail, in a solo title at least. And so I probably never would have picked up Green Lantern Earth 1 in isolation. It's not a character I tend to normally read a lot of. It's a Elseworlds alternate continuity version of them. So it's not really a book that normally would be designed for me. But because I was kind of covering the Earth 1 imprint and trying to get a sense of what the entire thing was like, I had to kind of leave no stone unturned. So I read both volumes, and it's ended up being one of my favorite comics of the last kind of decade. I think both books are absolutely phenomenal. And then I turned those into a really interesting video, which kind of shone a light on, because by the time that those books came out, especially the second volume, interest in the and kind of promotion of the Earth 1 line had kind of dissipated. There was a real period in which DC were pushing it hard when Johns' Batman books and J. Max Rosinski's Superman books were coming out. But like post Rebirth, DC kind of stopped really pushing or promoting the Earth 1 books. So I feel like the Green Lantern series kind of went under the radar by some. And so to be able to cover it and talk about why I think it's such an interesting reinvention of the character and such a, not only a great Green Lantern story, but just a great sci-fi comic story in its own right. And for the video to kind of introduce so many people who either didn't know that this book existed or had heard of it but hadn't read it or didn't know if they were going to like it or not, to explain it and introduce it to them and sell it to them as this is this really interesting book. And I sat down and talked with one of the writers of the book and got his perspective on it and included that in the video. Loads of people, I got tons of messages and comments on that video of people saying that they went out and read that book and picked up a copy because of my recommendation and because of my analysis of it in the video. And like, that's why we do it. And it's a book I probably wouldn't have read if it wasn't for the work I do. And now it's a book that I would absolutely recommend to anyone. It's a book that I'll definitely go back and read, and it's a book that really means a lot to me now.
That is brilliant. Honestly, that is just amazing. When you just find something that strikes that chord and then you're successfully able to get other people to discover it as well. That's just so brilliant.
I should say, if anyone's listening to this and hasn't read Green Lantern Earth 1, please go and do so.
Highly recommend it.
It's like one part Alien, it's one part Star Wars, it's one part Dune, it's one part like John Carter from Mars. It's great. Go and read it. You'll love it.
It's got the Superhero Project stamp of approval. Go read it.
How about you, Mikayla?
So I was thinking about my answer for it, and I realized that a couple years ago I wrote a paper that was bad, but I had the basic premise of Darkseid, the villain in DC Comics, essentially having the same power as us, the reader. I think Owen and I, we've discussed this a couple times, the whole idea of, well, you can technically control time in a comic by flipping it backwards and forwards, and Darkseid wants to basically control everything, so there's all these ideas of the reader having the same ability as Darkseid. And at the time, I went, okay, I want to read as much, not necessarily modern Darkseid, but post-Jack Kirby Darkseid as I can. So I was rereading stuff like Final Crisis, and then I picked up Cosmic Odyssey, and I wasn't exactly looking forward to it, even though a lot of people are probably going, what? How could you not look forward to it? And the simple fact is that as a kid, I'd read a lot of Jim Starlin stuff and just didn't like it. I do now, so it's a very big difference between my taste as a child and my taste as an adult. But I wasn't looking forward to it, and when I finally sat and read it, I found a book that I have revisited probably more times than any other book. Just because it strikes such a chord with me. Specifically, there's a bit with, without going into spoilers, because I do want people to read it. I'd never been interested in the character of Jon Stewart much outside of the animated Timverse, as we all call it. But there's a scene where, like, the weight of his actions really strikes home with him, and there's even a comment Martian Manhunter makes. And I was sat there not realizing that I was crying for the both of them. It was just so impactful. And even though nothing in the book ended up in the paper, it's one of those books that I am so glad that I picked up, even if I thought it was just going to be fodder material for an essay. So that's another one people should read.
I also love how kind of your thesis on Darkseid there is the most Morrisonian thing possible. And
Which is really weird.
It's very similar to something I've been writing about recently. I'm working on a chapter for a book. I don't want to go into too much more detail because the book isn't out yet. I don't know how much I can actually talk about it.
When it is out, I do want you to come back and we can talk about it because I know roughly what it's about.
Oh, absolutely. But it's the chapter I wrote is looking at All-Star Superman by Morrison and Frank Whiteley from a kind of historical contextual perspective, and also from the perspective of kind of meta-narratives. And the thing that really gravitated me towards covering the book is, so for those of you who haven't read it, it's essentially an Elseworld Superman story where at the start, Superman finds out he has a year left to live. And it's all about how he and the world around him grapples with this realization that this once invulnerable hero is facing death. I won't get into the premise more than that because that's all you really need to know for a Cliff Notes. But that book was inspired by the writer Grant Morrison losing their own father the previous year, and how the memory and the legacy of their father mirrors and parallels their feelings and the escapism they experienced as a child and also as an adult through superheroes, specifically through Superman as the archetypical superhero. So the book becomes a tribute and a commentary and a meta-narrative on not only Walter Morrison, Grant's father, but also the idea of fatherhood and how we look up to those and father figures, with Superman being the ultimate father figure in fiction. So that was my lens into that. And one of the things that I really hammered home in the piece, and one of the things I really argued, was this idea that Morrison talks about in the novel Super Gods, where they say that superheroes are just as real as we are. There's this great quote from Morrison where they say, like, in 100 years' time, no one will remember me, but everyone will remember Superman. So how is he not real? Superman has changed the world. Superman has made people's lives better. Superman has inspired people and given them the strength to find the strength within themselves that they didn't know they had in dire situations. So how is that not real? There's so many, you can tangibly assess the impacts of this character, even if they don't exist in our world. In some plane of reality, they do. And that's a theme that gets explored quite a lot in the book, and I don't want to get into too much spoilers because it's the best. So you talking about that idea of Darkseid controlling time in the same way that we do. It's just a theme and an approach that really resonates with me in my own writing. It's
one of those papers where I think the more you and I have spoken, the more I've gone, I really need to rewrite that paper because it was not great.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a fascinating idea there, I'd say.
Yeah. It's interesting that we talk about like superheroes being as real as us. I was recently watching this documentary on Netflix that was about the Waco massacre in America. And I went in knowing very little about it. I know it happened, mostly because we're English. We're kind of, what's the word? Ignorant to things going on outside of our frame of reference. But I think that's true of all cultures. And what struck me is one of the pararescue and the ATF agents they were talking to, he made a specific comment that the rest of the police couldn't come because they were already there. There was no Spider-Man to help us. It was very odd that one of the first things that came to his mind was something like Spider-Man.
Yeah.
It's this idea that they are as real as us, even if we can't go out and physically talk to them. It's a comforting thought to have superheroes around.
Yeah. And I think that like one of my favorite quotes that kind of relates to that is from Jack Kirby, and King uses it in his Mr. Miracle series,
yeah.
where Kirby explains the idea of what the fourth world is, and King uses it to bookend the book, and it's the best. Where he basically says that like the first world is the past; it's the world of Jack's parents. The second world is the world he exists in the present day. It's the third world is where he's going, his future, when Jack grows old, has kids, has a family, and then passes away. And the fourth world is his imagination. It's his legacy. It's the things inside his head and in his heart and such and such. And I think that's such a perfect synthesis of comics in general and the kind of legacy that they hold within us. This idea of the fourth world isn't necessarily a tangible, real thing in our kind of physical sense, but mentally it kind of is. Even if we can't touch superheroes as if they're next to us, we have physical proof of them in not only the kind of books and the movies and so on, but also in how they kind of shape us as people, whether that be just kind of like inspiring us and telling us stories of good versus evil, or more like philosophical and deep questions about morality and ethics. I just think it's really interesting, and it's why, like I said, coming from a historian's background and someone that has worked in more kind of traditional historian circles, there is always kind of a bit of not a stigma, but being a kind of comics historian is kind of almost given a bit of a peculiar look, as opposed to being a historian of newspapers or such and such. Whereas for me, I think it's an equally valid thing to do, because not only is this kind of one of the longest running kind of industries of any sort of media in the world, not only is it the kind of closest thing we have to kind of modern folklore and mythology, it's a book, it's a series, and it's a universe that's ran for the last 100 years that has seen so much evolution and change throughout human history. And by studying these stories and these characters and how they've evolved and changed throughout that period, we learn so much about ourselves and our society and our culture and our history. And that mindset and that approach is kind of at the heart of what I do, both in my professional academic work and both what I do on Owen Likes Comics as well. Just interested to see what you two think about that statement.
Well, so I really do relate to a lot of what you said. And I think that a big reason why my content has changed and evolved is also, again, like I said, it's grown up with me. But I think a large part of how I have grown as a person has been significantly because I have been reading comic books as a full-time job now, and because it's so fascinating. Like you said, you can learn a lot about yourself through reading these morality tales of good versus evil. But also, one of the things that I think has really cemented my love for comics, because at first when I first started reading, like, oh cool, great art, good action, some plot twists, sure. But now that I've been falling more in love with the historical side and learning everything, I feel like I'm part of something bigger as well, especially because of how meta-contextual a lot of the books tend to be. They'll either like reference past work, or they'll be direct commentations on the actual act of reading a comic. Take Morrison's Multiversity. There's a great issue where the comic book directly speaks to the reader, saying that the book exists simply because you are hearing their voice in your head right now by reading it. And the mere act of reading gives the comic life, that you are making it come alive. And when you finish the book, you kill the book. And yet you have the power of God to reread it over and over, to give birth and to create death as many times as you would like, which I found so deeply interesting. And that's a connection that I haven't felt with video games, movies, or anything else. I feel like with comics, I am playing a part in the narrative, and that I am a crucial part of the world as well. It does feel like, especially because I've read more of Morrison style books, it always comes back to Morrison, that we are all part of like a grand tapestry of this medium. I feel more connected with comic fans than I do anything else. If I go see the latest Fast and the Furious, I can talk with my friends about it, and it's cool. We're like, oh man, it was so cool whenever like did the car jump this, but the conversation.
It was cool when the car did that. I will not have any slander of the family on this podcast.
No, it is cool.
That is a mythology unto itself.
It is. But like, when the conversations you and I have though about comics, yes, we start fanboying about like cool epic action moments, but also I feel that us comic fans, when we start talking about, we get into a lot more of philosophy as the conversations go on, and I find that to be very, very fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that like that is definitely the thing that keeps me such a big fan and lover of the medium and why it is such a big part of my career. But it's also why I love the kind of two professional spaces that I work in. I always use the analogy to my current supervisor that I'm kind of like an academic Hannah Montana, where I'm one half like serious historian academic and the other half I'm what's up guys, welcome back to the channel YouTuber. And kind of bridging those two worlds together. And it's why I appreciate not only the work that kind of people within the comic YouTube online media space do, people like yourself, people like Matt, people like Chris from Comic Tropes, Scott from NerdSync, and so on and so forth, but also the work that people like you, Mikayla, do, and all of the people at the Superhero Project. It's why I love so much being involved with the work you do at the conferences, and also working with other people involved with the project in other avenues and other ventures as well. It's a community, and it understands something I love a great deal in a way that feels so natural, if that makes sense. And to find that shared love and interest and passion for research and analysis in two broadly different fields, or maybe they're not that different, but two at face value different fields of kind of like more traditional academia and then new online Wild West internet media, is just fascinating and really cool to me, to be able to kind of not only carve out a little niche space in both, but to bring those two worlds together.
Now that is, first of all, thank you. I do have to agree when it comes to particularly superhero studies and superhero academia and just superhero passion. I think when you say to another academic that you look at comics, or specifically you look at superheroes, you are going to get that look. It may only last like half a second, but you're going to get
definitely.
it.
But it's like there is that. Yeah. But then not to cut you off, but like you do definitely get that stigma. But then I think of all of the interesting things that people brought last year at the Superhero Project conference. There was so much interesting stuff being done, so many thought-provoking analyses of different books, and not only comics but films, and the kind of the industries that surround these characters. Is some of the most interesting academic work I've read in years came out of that conference. And as well, talking about Drake with things that you've created, using the Miracle Man documentary as an example, that again is some of the most interesting thought-provoking research that I've seen in a while as well. And that's all in a space within comics that in some circles it's kind of looked down upon as a kind of scholarly topic and medium to cover.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of the conference last year, we had the paper from Dr. Mark Hibbert, who was essentially showing us just data, but he was walking through it in this way where we understood all the changes that Dr. Doom had been through in years. And the punchline was, Jim Shooter fucked it up.
I could do a whole hour just talking about Mark's presentation last year.
It still sticks with me, and I think he sent me his paper to go through. But it's that passion. If someone outside of our fan base or passioner looks at what he was presenting, it is essentially just data. But it was the way he was able to weave it into contextual history and storylines and changes of writers and artists. It was such a fascinating exploration.
It really was. And it was such interesting, and not to kind of just tangent this into talking about Mark's research. I'm now putting my flag in the ground. Please get Mark on the podcast, because I could listen to him talk about his work for hours. But his research was interesting because obviously he's coming at it from a more kind of mathematical and science fiction and scientific background. It uses a lot of like English language techniques like corpus linguistics. And so it's already interdisciplinary, just its methodology. And yet it's looking at comic book panels from the 1960s and 70s. And there were so many interesting papers last year, so many things that opened my mind and blew my mind, and I really, really love listening to. But that was one of the ones where I had this kind of existential out-of-body experience moment listening to Mark talk about his research. And I was like, this is great academic work of any discipline, of any style. This is incredible, thought-provoking, interesting, novel, unique academic research. And it is as good as anything that's covered in any kind of prestigious journal in any other field. And it's about Dr. Doom and how Jim Shooter drew his cape wrong. And it's great.
I still remember that talk because I think afterwards Danny said, you and Owen just looked like you completely left your bodies and were just astral projecting the whole time because apparently we
Honestly.
just had mouths gaping. But
Y'all
that's
gotta
the
get me out there
thing.
for that. It looked so much fun.
I'm hoping to record them this year, but that's a half promise. It depends if people want their stuff recording.
Sure, sure.
But no, that whole thing of like, if you say to someone you study superheroes, on the surface, that sounds like such a small niche thing. But like you just said, Mark was coming at it from a scientific data analysis standpoint. You come at it from a history standpoint. I'm a narratologist, so I look at it from a narrative standpoint. Just because we're looking at something that might sound stupid to the outside world, it doesn't mean we're not getting this rich tapestry of culture from it, from all these different angles. And that's something I admire both of your works for.
Yeah, and it's this idea of like, there's so much interesting research being done in the comic space, and it's interesting to see it be done in two very different approaches. Like I said, being done in kind of more traditional academic avenues of conferences and published work and talks and articles, but also to see it being done on the internet as well. I just think it's great.
Well, the internet has
Superheroes
changed
are
a lot of
awesome.
how we consume things in general, and I think
Well,
that
exactly.
I having been someone that was practically raised by the internet, I was always watching various different types of content, from, you know, the old days of albino black sheep and Newgrounds to the rise of shows on Blip TV. But seeing how many new types of content can come out of just having the ability for any person to produce their own work and distribute it on a large platform has been mind-blowing. I mean, the amount of 4-hour-long videos about child TV shows that I've never watched, they're incredible. There's all sorts of new content that you would never see in a more traditional publishing avenue, whether it be newspapers, television, film, academic journals, etc., that you can only really get because of the personal, small scale avenue that is online content creation.
Yeah, and this is something I say a lot as well when I kind of justify my approach of doing both kind of traditional academic publishing work and also kind of taking my research and my interests and putting them on a YouTube channel as well. It's this idea that like there is a real problem in academia of paywalls for journals and information not being readily and freely available. I don't like the idea of people being priced out of learning things in any situation. I just think that's gross.
And to add to that before you carry on, it's even worse that the actual writers of these things aren't the ones receiving the money. It's just the company publishing it.
Yep.
Exactly. So I have a lot of frustrations with academic publishing, as most academics do. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say, that it's a problem and a frustration for a lot of academics. And so because of that, if I was to publish, say, for example, the Superman Blue video as an academic article or a journal, and it went on a journal behind a paywall, I don't know how many people are going to read that.
Yeah.
That might only 100 people might only ever read that. I don't know. 1 million people could read it. It could be 100. I don't know. Partly because then it's kind of out of my hands, but it's not readily available. That information isn't getting out there. That's, in my opinion, interesting research and something worthy of conversation that's kind of getting locked away in a vault and lost. And even if
you're
it's
also not getting that real-time feedback, because you'd have to have someone pay to read it and then have to write a response that might not even be published somewhere that you can see.
Well, exactly. But also, even if it's published on like an open access journal, which is a much kind of more ethical approach, there's still no guarantee of how many people are going to read it. How many people outside of academia read those types of published work? I don't know. Whereas if I publish it on YouTube, you get hundreds of thousands, if not millions in some instances, learning about these things. And even if only like 2% of them actually really engage with the topic and follow that up with their own scholarly research, or even just kind of sit and think about it, that's still so many people that have kind of engaged with something you've researched and thought about it and had some sort of response or an interesting thought of their own. So it really is kind of like taking, that's it, if we can take the approaches and the principles of academic research of presenting well-sourced, cited, accurate information that's well written, that's concise, that is honest and of integrity, and all of the great academic practices. And we can put that on a platform with a kind of direct view of thousands and hundreds and thousands, and sometimes millions of people, then that's a great thing. That's an incredible way of getting that research out there with people who might not otherwise engage with that kind of research. And I think that's a justification of not only kind of what Mikayla, what you and the project do, and what I myself do in some instances, but also what people like Drake, you and other kind of comic YouTubers and TikTokers and other people in a kind of social media space do as well. And I think it shows the importance and the value of both fields.
Well, I think something very important is that the average person is curious. The average person does want to learn. It's just that so much of that is inaccessible, whether it be financial or also just someone like me that has a short attention span. I used to be able to read books that were hundreds of pages long when I was a kid, but now I do find it difficult to sit down and read. And while it does frustrate me that I will spend multiple nights staying up until 4 a.m. editing my videos so they look as visually interesting as possible. A lot of people just listen to my content, and that's ultimately fine, because there's also a lot of content that I mostly listen to. Now, granted, I have it on a second monitor, so I kind of look at it in the corner of my eye, but I can also let my ADHD brain be playing Minecraft at the same time. It's easily consumable. And one of the things that I watch just a wide breadth of things on YouTube. It's not all nerdy stuff. Like I've gotten really into science and engineering. It's concepts that I will never fully grasp, but my girlfriend will ask me, instead of like, oh, how was your day? It's like, what did you learn today? And I'll be like, oh, actually, I learned how an air conditioner works. So did you know that the coolant liquid? And I'll just go on to this like big ramble there. But that's something that I would never have looked into myself. But I saw an interesting thumbnail, an interesting premise of like, how does an air conditioning work? I was like, oh, how does it work? And I like having those questions being answered. And I've learned so much from so many places just because it has been in one central area. The bar to entry was nothing. I mean, I pay for YouTube Premium, so I can watch less ads and more content while still supporting the creators. But I love to hear this stuff, even if I'll never have any practical use for learning how an air conditioner works. I'm still feel like my life has been enriched for doing that.
Yeah.
It's just the joys of the internet, and I wish particularly academia would embrace those avenues even more. I mean, I consider Drake, you may not consider yourself it, but Drake, you're an academic.
It's taken some while to get around to it. I try not to mention YouTube when I talk to people. I've never really liked telling the average person on the street that I'm a YouTuber. It brings different connotations. And then also
I was going to say, that's the thing. That's the interesting thing, because Mikayla, you mentioned like being looked down upon for being a comic scholar.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to explain to someone that you're a comic scholar and also a YouTuber. You're going to be like shunned and exiled from your community.
Yeah, so that's why I'm tired of answering like the same 5 questions over and over and over again, because it is novel for people. People do know YouTubers exist, and it's something that people are generally curious about. They just don't really have the opportunity to meet one in person, so they want to ask every question they've had burning right then and there. I just don't always have the mental energy for that. So now when people ask what I do, if I don't want the conversation to go further, I just say that I'm a video editor, and that I'll leave it at that. But for some other people, that like if I'm willing to have a conversation, I'll say that that I'm a comic book historian, and then I just talk about superheroes for a bit because they're curious about that. But I never go into the YouTube aspect until like it actually gets to that point, if I want the conversation to be deeper. So it's been weird actually identifying as a level of academic these days. It's taken a lot of time to take that label on, but I'm glad that I'm not just being pretentious and that I have y'all's actual air of credibility.
No, absolutely. I definitely consider you an academic, even if someone turns around and says, well, actually, he's not affiliated. It's like, I don't care. I'm affiliating him with a university right now.
Well, thank you. Happy to come and talk if given the opportunity.
I will fly you over at some point.
I would love for that to happen. I absolutely love the time I went over to the UK. I would love to see more. That Batman restaurant we went to, top.
Oh god, they've started serving Big Belly burgers ever since
What?
the Blue Beetle trailer went out.
Oh, have you gone back since?
I haven't, but a friend of mine's been a couple times because she does press stuff. So she gets sent there quite a bit, and she just posted these pictures of it.
I can imagine.
Have you seen the place though?
Yeah, I'm familiar.
It's incredible. I mean, the duck that I bought was like what 40 pounds, and it was 3 bites, but those bites were incredible.
Mm.
Some of the best food I've ever had.
And the what was it? The apple balloon.
That was mid, to be honest.
That
But
it was a weird experience, but still.
I don't want to suggest that we've gone off course here.
sorry.
It's still Batman themed.
But
It is true.
I was looking over as I was listening to this riveting conversation. In the corner of my eye, I spotted my copy of Mark Evaniers' Kirby King of Comics, and it got me thinking of an interesting final question I could pose, because I'm trying to be somewhat cautious of our listeners' time.
Sure, of course.
Definitely. Final question.
We touched on Poison Chalice a little bit earlier, which, if anyone hasn't read, it's a fascinating historical account of Alan Moore's run on Miracle Man and the entire kind of historical story of Marvel Man / Miracle Man. It's a incredible read. It's such a great book. But it got me thinking about maybe some superhero scholarly texts that we might want to recommend. Drake, I'd be interested in hearing if there's any books that you found really useful. You mentioned a bit before that if you're watching a video or reading something academic-wise and they include an interesting source, you will kind of make a note of it and go back and look at it later. So I'd be really interested in seeing if there's a specific book that you'd recommend or one that you use a lot when researching your videos.
I don't know if anybody has heard of Marvel Comics, The Untold Story. That's never been mentioned before in any content. But no. So in all seriousness, I haven't had the opportunity to read a whole bunch of extra scholarly books. I will say there is a very interesting collection of books called Comics Creators On, where they'll have various writers and artists from a particular bit. I've only read the Comics Creators On X-Men, and I found a lot of very exclusive information there. Also, I have to recommend, of course, as soon as I start to form the sentence, it all goes out the window. The Comics Journal, that's a periodical that I think is phenomenal. You also can't forget about Alter Ego from Tomorrow's publication. Back Issue, that is also one of their publications. Highly recommend that. But an interesting one that I think people haven't heard of, because it was a very small run out of one university. It was Lord, I just took off all the books on my bookshelf, so I don't have it handy, but it's called Milestone Media and Their Fans, I think it's called. And it's an academic look back at the whole Milestone Comics project.
Oh, Black Superheroes, Milestone Comics and Their Fans. Yeah, yes, I've got that one.
Yes, very, very good. I did that from my retrospective on Static Shock. Very underrated book. It's hard to get a copy, but I managed to find it.
That sounds
It's by Jeffrey Brown, if anyone's looking for it.
I'm looking for it. I need to pick this up. This sounds great.
Yeah.
No, it is a fantastic book.
Yeah, I think you mentioned some really great sources there. I think what people like the Comics Journal do and the Comics Creators On series they're so useful, both as a historian looking for information and looking for quotes and extracts to use as sources in my writing, but also just as a fan interested in learning more about the creators and the context behind specific stories.
Oh yeah.
I mentioned Mark Evaniers' work because it's sat next to me, but he is someone that has personally inspired my research quite a fair bit. He is someone that works in the industry, very close connections to Jack Kirby, and has written and published lots of academic work on superhero history, a lot of it pertaining to that era of Marvel and DC when Kirby was working there, and his kind of accounts of that is just deeply, deeply fascinating. Sean Howe, you mentioned not being able to do this without talking about Marvel, The Untold Story, an incredible book, a book that I think I would argue, if anyone is doubting the credibility of comics as a source to use for historical research, the work that Sean did in that book is second to none exceptional. Another source I really enjoy, another writer I really enjoy is Brian Cronin.
Yes.
The work that he's done with CBR for the last God knows how many years is always a name that pops back up in my research. Any burning question I seem to have had over the years, at one point he has attempted to answer. So I'm eternally grateful for that.
Excellent.
And also Grant Morrison's book Super Gods, which is like one part an autobiography of Morrison and their work, but one part kind of a comprehensive deep dive into the entire history of superheroes as an archetype and an art form. So it's the best, and it's written by Morrison, so you know it's going to be great.
I hide my copy from you because you know it's signed.
Yeah, one day I'm going to swap them without you noticing.
All I'll do is she'll never expect me.
All I'm saying, Mikayla, is it would be a wonderful birthday present, and I'll leave it at that.
Oh God.
Should we wrap this podcast up? Unless you wanted to recommend any other books that maybe you haven't talked about on the pod yet.
I'm desperately trying to think of ones that we haven't already mentioned. Obviously, Sean Howe is a fantastic example. I'd also recommend another book he did before that called Give Our Regards to the Atom Smashers.
Yes.
Which I think is pretty hard to find nowadays, but I've found a few used copies every now and then. One academic book that I think I read just because I was sick of reading academic books that were strictly related to my PhD at the time. I read The Secret History of Wonder Woman by Jill Lepore, and surprisingly, it was one of the most fascinating books I read last year.
That sounds really good.
It was really good. There's also an audiobook for anyone who tends to not want to read after a while, because
me.
I may have half listened, half read it, but it was a fantastic book, and I'll have to give that one a shout out. But I do want to say thank you to both of you for coming on the podcast. I definitely want you guys back again in the future when we can focus on like specific subjects, but I think having a perspective on talking about superheroes on YouTube was just a fantastic little starter point for you guys.
Yeah, I'm very happy to come back. This has been the highlight of my week, honestly.
Considering it's Friday, I'll take that as a compliment. The last time someone said that to me, it was a Monday.
I've been dealing with plumbing issues all week. It's a low bar, but you guys leaped, soared, and flew above it.
Leap tall buildings in a single bound, as they say.
I was trying to make that work. I just couldn't quite figure out the right phrasing.
So do you two want to plug anything that you've got coming out? I know you both released videos yesterday, I want to say, which would probably be like a couple days ago by the time this goes out.
Owen, you were just talking about your upcoming video.
Sure, I'll go first. Yes, thank you, Mikayla, for having me on this podcast. I've been pushing and prodding you to invite me on since even before the podcast actually started.
Fun fact, readers, Owen is the only reason this podcast exists.
Yes, so it's a nice full circle. We can stop now. I just needed another avenue to talk to my friends and just gush about Grant Morrison books, as if that's not something I do enough. But yes, it's been an absolute delight chatting to you both, as it always is. If you're interested in hearing more of my writing and my work, youtube.com/Owen Likes Comics is where you can find all of the videos. Next up, releasing next week when you're listening to this, I will be diving into The Flash of Two Worlds from 1961. It's a one-issue Flash story, which I argue might be one of the most important comics ever told.
At least in the top 10.
I will second that.
Especially with a lot of kind of current goings on in comic book movies and adaptations, and how important the idea of the multiverse and continuity is. This might be top 5 most important comics ever written. So we'll be looking into the history of that, how it came to be, what was interesting about it, and what the legacy of this very kind of unassuming one-issue story from the Silver Age, actually, what the legacy of it is. So yes, youtube.com/Owen Likes Comics. You can follow me on Twitter at Owen Likes Comics. And I'm always kind of hovering around with whatever the superhero project does, just trying to keep my foot in the door, as you could say.
Brilliant. Great. You want to play us out?
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube and at www.comicdrake.com. That's a direct link right to the channel. I do have a video coming soon on Secret Invasion, which I'll be honest, I don't know how great that one's going to be. I think the subject has already been covered to death quite a bit on YouTube. However, after that, I'm probably going to be doing a video on the Marvel Barbie comics from the mid-90s.
Oh, hell yes.
I found an issue once at a half-price books. I never actually gave them a read, but I managed to find copies of the whole series, so I'm going to read that, and I'm hoping that by the time I'm done reading them, I'll have had something interesting to say about them. So in theory, that video will be coming soon, and that's what I'm very excited about.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And yeah, enjoy comics. That's all we can say.